Believe it or not, I'm one that really likes free speech. A lot of people don't understand that. But I am a big believer. When you start regulating, a lot of bad things can happen. We're under assault. Very simple. We're under assault. We believe in the right to free speech. As the radical left moves aggressively to curtail freedom of speech, we are proudly defending free speech, including our college campuses. Free speech is a bedrock of American life. Our constitutional rights must be fiercely protected.
President Trump has said on numerous occasions the First Amendment right to free speech is very important to him. In fact, during his time in office, the president has signed numerous executive orders aimed at protecting that right. But many of the president's critics say his own language and rhetoric has sown division in our country, creating an environment making it harder than ever to defend contentious ideas without threatening free speech. In her latest book called Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, PEN America CEO Suzanne Nossel breaks down how she believes we can coexist in a diverse and divided society while maintaining free and open speech. And Suzanne joins me now. Welcome, Suzanne. A pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Suzanne, you lay out 20 principles in your book that aim to help society use free speech as a tool to help others rather than fuel controversy. Can you elaborate on how these principles are broken up?
Sure. I have principles for when you're a speaker, and they include being conscientious with language. So being mindful about how a term you use may be heard, if it could be possibly offensive to someone, if it might be considered out of date, if you're calling somebody by the wrong pronoun. I also talk about a duty of care. If you have a big platform, you're on television, you're in front of the classroom, you've got to take extra precautions to make sure you know what you're talking about and you know how to bring it across in a way that will be heard and understood as you intend. And I have principles for listeners, like not jumping to conclusions and taking into account intent and context when you're evaluating speech. And then principles for how to think about free speech policy issues, like understanding that speech in some situations can cause real harm and being mindful of how to look at these questions of speech on the internet and how we ought to regulate digital speech.
So I have a question for you about when free speech veers into hate speech, because that's a sort of a line that's very difficult for us as a society to agree upon. We've seen the debate over the Confederate flag. For instance, the president sees that in many instances as free speech. Where would you draw that line? Do you give society guidelines for figuring out where that lies?
I do. I recognize that hateful speech is a problem in our society. And you began with that riff about President Trump. And I think he has uncorked that with his own attacks, whether it's on women or racial minorities or immigrants. And there's a sense that hateful speech is running through our society kind of unimpeded. And that has intensified the desire a lot of us have to try to police speech within the confines that we control, whether that's a magazine we run or a classroom we're in, or even the dining room table with our family. We get even more upset about hateful speech because we feel like it's not just an isolated incident. This is coursing through our whole society and making people feel denigrated and marginalized. I think it's very important for free speech defenders to fight against hateful speech and to reject slurs and bigotry. I don't think the right answer is extending the powers of our government to clamp down, because as you say, who defines it? One individual's idea of a slur may be in a different context, something that is historically appropriate, that is culturally understood, that is satirical. And the minute you empower government to extend its controls over speech, those authorities tend to use that discretion in very self-serving ways.
Right. So what role, if any, do you believe that social media companies such as Twitter or Facebook play in protecting free speech? They are so dominant in our society right now, and obviously all of these questions are being targeted online and in social media, the worlds of social media. So do they have a responsibility?
I think they do. And I talk in the book kind of about two sides of the equation. On the one hand, I think they absolutely have responsibility for the ways that speech has been weaponized online, whether it's cyberbullying or disinformation that is undercutting our democracy. We need the platforms to step up and address that. At the same time, I don't think we should give them unfettered discretion. They have their own motives. You know, they're profit-making companies. They have their own ideologies. Their algorithms often feed off the most incendiary kinds of content. So I don't think we can simply trust them. I think we need to trust and verify. And I think we need a much more robust system whereby individuals who believe that their posts and expression online has been interfered with or unjustifiably taken down have a recourse. Right now, these companies offer virtually no customer service at all, and that's a glaring gap that really undercuts free expression, especially as they become more aggressive in policing, as they will do. They're being forced to by their advertisers, by consumers, by regulators. We need a fail-safe to protect our free speech and ensure that if you feel you've been silenced on Facebook or Twitter, you've got a recourse.
Right. Okay. Now, so, you know, you write that the rules that govern free speech in the 21st century are being written now, both formally and informally. Can you expound a little bit on that for us? And also, would you talk about how that refers to or relates to so-called cancel culture?
Yeah, sure. Look, when you talk to an American about free speech, a lot of us tend to reflexively think of the First Amendment, and we trust in the courts and lawyers to defend those rights. But increasingly, the kinds of debates that we're having, whether it's over a speaker that gets canceled on a college campus or a Twitter fight that leads someone to close their account because they've been subject to death threats, that's not state action. That's not the government coming in and trying to shut us up. That's speech versus speech. And so we do need to, I believe, as individuals, become much more activated in defending our free speech rights. It's not good enough to just leave it up to the lawyers and the courts. When it comes to cancel culture, I think the term gets used very elastically. I think there's some people, maybe a Harvey Weinstein or a Bill Cosby, where we could all agree, the cancellation of them from our cultural life was appropriate. But then when it's a case of somebody who fires off one tweet and is disciplined or loses their job, that's extreme. And that's where it can have a chilling effect on speech for all of us if we have to worry that we might be next if we say something edgy.
Right. And so how would you define free speech? Because as we know, it doesn't mean entirely free. We cannot say whatever we want to say in the public sphere in this country. So how do you define it exactly?
To me, it is the encompassing idea of open, robust discourse where you have a whole breadth of ideas and opinions that are engaging with one another. And that doesn't mean we all each say everything that comes to mind. We all exercise a measure of self-restraint, and that's perfectly appropriate. We also have societal taboos like slurs, and I think that's actually necessary. You've got to put some things off limits in order for the rest to be a rough and tumble that's free-flowing. We also have certain government prohibitions on speech. The First Amendment is not absolute. There are categories like libel and defamation and true threats and incitement to imminent violence that are exceptions from the First Amendment, where we say there's a compelling government interest to actually regulate this type of speech, and we allow courts and legislators to do that. So free speech is not absolute, but I think it does require that people be able to voice contentious opinions, that you be able to push back against the orthodoxy, that you can dissent and disagree, whether publicly and privately. And right now there are a lot of constraints on that, and they're closing in.
Are you optimistic, Suzanne, about the future of free speech in this country?
Ultimately I am. I think we have a rising generation that's deeply committed to driving forward to the next level of inclusion and equality and anti-racism, and that's a very positive thing. But they also do care about free speech, and my purpose in the book, and Dare to Speak, really is to explain how those values can come together, that driving forward that social justice agenda need not and should not come at the expense of free speech. In fact, free speech is essential to your ability to get out in the streets and make your point and go in front of Congress and put up your poster. And so we all depend on these rights and need to defend them.
All right, Suzanne Nossel, author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.